Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome to WCW Wednesday right here on NoDQ.com, the YouTube channel, and NoDQ&A Videos affiliate, RingsideNews.com. Today I will be looking back at the WCW pay-per-views from 1999. And this was the year that things really started to fall apart for WCW. Things were starting to get bad in 98, but business was hot. And business was hot at the start of 1999. You had the sold-out pay-per-view. Ric Flair was in charge. You had the NWO reunited, NWO Hollywood and NWO Wolfpack. You had the whole finger poke of doom with Hogan and Nash. And, this pay-per-view was fine. I mean, no real issues. Wasn't the worst pay-per-view. Wasn't the best pay-per-view. Once again, Kidman, Juventud Guerrero, Psychosis, Rey Mysterio Jr. You had a four-way match for the Cruiserweight title. This was excellent. Another tremendous Cruiserweight match. And then you had the big star matches. You had David Flair teaming up in the ring for the first time with his father against Barry Windham and Curt Hennig. I actually really liked the angle they did after the match with the NWO coming out and beating up David Flair and Ric Flair's handcuffed. I thought that this was really well done. This was a good angle. In the main event, Goldberg versus Scott Hall. Enjoyable match. I thought it was a pretty good main event. And Goldberg getting his revenge on Scott Hall. No real issues with this. This was a fine main event match. And you got to see Goldberg get some payback on Scott Hall. So this was fine. Next up, you had SuperBrawl 99. This would turn out to be the last WCW pay-per-view that did a really big buy rate number. And it was all downhill after this. You had Hogan versus Flair. So this match was a big draw. You had the build-up where Ric Flair was getting beat up by the NWO every week. So you figured on the pay-per-view Ric Flair would finally get his revenge on the NWO. But no, you have David Flair turning on Ric Flair. And I will say, I mean, it was a good angle. If Ric Flair hadn't gotten beat up so many times leading up to this match, I think this would have been really good. But, fans wanted to see Ric Flair finally get his payback on the NWO and Hogan. But it didn't happen here. David Flair turns on Ric Flair. I like the storyline where Torrie Wilson is seducing David Flair and convinces him to turn on his father. I mean, it makes logical sense. It's just, you buried Ric Flair so badly leading up to this match. Literally, they left him laying in a field on the Nitro before this show. So you want to see Ric Flair get his payback, and it doesn't happen. So, WCW just all over the place here with their booking. DDP versus Scott Steiner. This was a very good match. Scott Steiner was coming into his own as Big Papa Pump. I enjoyed this a lot. He just beat the crap out of DDP and made him submit. Scott Steiner looked really strong here. I thought that this was very good. Then you had the big match with the Outsiders against Conan and Rey Mysterio Jr. Rey Mysterio would end up losing his mask here. This was entertaining to watch. The main event matches were definitely interesting. And, this was a solid pay-per-view from WCW. One of their last above-average pay-per-views, in my opinion. Next up, we have Uncensored 99. You had a entertaining hardcore match, an ECW special, Hack versus Bam Bam Bigelow versus Raven. I enjoyed this. This was a good hardcore match. You had Chris Benoit and Dean Malenko finally winning the WCW Tag Team titles against Barry Windham and Curt Hennig. This was a good match, but this was when WCW was really changing course here. You had the NWO as the heels against the Horsemen as the baby faces, and all of a sudden the Horsemen are bending the rules, and Ric Flair is starting to act very heelish. And you saw it with this match, and then you would see it in the main event. I'll get to that in a second. Perry Saturn versus Chris Jericho in a dog collar match. Not really a good match, but it is noteworthy because it was Jericho's last WCW pay-per-view appearance in a match. And it was just sad to see Chris Jericho with so much momentum in '98, and WCW basically just gave up on him. and he would go on to WWE and become one of the biggest superstars of the new millennium. So, big loss for WCW, and they really dropped the ball here with Jericho. Yeah, the TV title, Booker T versus Scott Steiner. Buff Bagwell would accidentally cost Steiner the match, and that would lead to their breakup. And then you have the main event, Hogan versus Flair. An enjoyable match. I mean, Hogan and Flair went all out. They gave it their best effort in this match, and it was one of the better Flair versus Hogan matches. But the booking here, basically what they did was a double turn. Hogan and the NWO became baby faces, and Ric Flair and the Horsemen became heels. It was not what people wanted to see. And say what you will about the finger poke of doom, but the ratings were still up, and SuperBrawl did a big buy rate. This did a good buy rate as well. So there was still intrigue in seeing Ric Flair as a babyface against Hogan as a heel. But people did not want to see Ric Flair as a heel here. And this pretty much backfired for WCW, because following this angle, you really started to notice a decline in WCW's popularity, and people started tuning out, and the buy rates would start dropping. House show attendance would start dropping. Live event attendance would go down. People did not want to see a heel Ric Flair. So this was a huge mistake by WCW to do this double turn, and it was not what people wanted to see. Yes, Ric Flair finally got one over on Hulk Hogan, but by him going heel, that was not the way people wanted to see it go down. Moving on here, we have Spring Stampede 99. This was a very good pay-per-view from WCW, in my opinion. Probably the last really good WCW pay-per-view from top to bottom. This was after their big logo change and a new look for WCW. They ditched their classic logo for the whole Space Age logo, which I was never a big fan of. And I think that was another mistake they made by changing the logo and just doing something that, the logo looked very weird. And I think that might have actually turned people off as well. Not just the quality of the product, but, just changing the logo and changing the look of the company was not something that people really cared for. This show, very solid card from top to bottom. Juventud Guerrera versus Blitzkrieg. This was a very good match. Hardcore match, Bam Bam Bigelow versus Hack. Very entertaining. So you had a variety on the show. You had great cruiserweight action. You had the hardcore match. You had Rey Mysterio versus Kidman for the cruiserweight title. That was another good match. You had good tag team wrestling. You had Benoit and Malenko against Perry Saturn and Raven. So you really had a good variety of strong matches on this show. And then you had the main event matches, Goldberg versus Kevin Nash. Even though the NWO was going babyface, Kevin Nash was a heel in this match. Very confusing right now during this period. Not really sure how to react to Kevin Nash, because one minute he's acting like a babyface, the next minute he's acting like a heel. But this was Goldberg's big revenge from Starrcade, so I guess that was fine for Goldberg to get his payback on Nash. And then you had the main event, DDP versus Hogan versus Flair versus Sting, who just randomly made his return. And you had Randy Savage as the special guest referee, also making his return to WCW. All of it was very sudden and completely random, as it seems like they just brought these guys back when they were ready, but they didn't really have a good storyline for them, so they just threw them into a match. Hogan was injured legitimately, and he was taken out of the match about 5 minutes in. And the really weird thing here was Savage had come back as a babyface, but then, for whatever reason, he helps DDP win the match, and anybody that had followed WCW knew that DDP and Savage were, these major enemies. So why would they be working together all of a sudden? So it didn't really make sense, and WCW, in typical fashion, didn't really explain it. Next up, we have Slamboree. You could tell things were really getting bad in WCW at this point. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, with the Ric Flair heel turn, it just wasn't connecting with the audience, and ratings started dropping. The live attendance started dropping, and the pay-per-view buy rate for this was about half of what it was for the SuperBrawl pay-per-view a few months earlier. They had these matches here, but none of them were very good. You had Gorgeous George versus Charles Robinson. At least this was entertaining. I personally found this to be entertaining. You had the U.S. title, Steiner versus Bagwell, and you had the Steiner brothers reuniting. And it was very confusing because it wasn't really made clear if Rick Steiner was part of the NWO with Scott Steiner. They didn't really go anywhere with that and didn't acknowledge where Rick Steiner was at. But this was a point where the NWO was kind of just fading away, and they didn't really have an official breakup of the NWO. They just over the course of several months, the NWO was just mentioned less and less, and guys were going in different directions. Buff Bagwell was no longer in the NWO. The whole thing was just very confusing. You had Roddy Piper versus Ric Flair for control of WCW. Flair was in charge. Eric Bischoff came out at the end and said that Roddy Piper had won the match. This was also very confusing because Bischoff was out of power. So all of a sudden, how did he have the authority to say Piper was the winner? I mean, it was just a complete mess. And Eric Bischoff was doing this whole babyface turn, saying, I made mistakes in WCW, and we're gonna come back and win the ratings war and be number one again. Yada yada yada. The whole thing just was a mess. Goldberg versus Sting once again. This should have been a classic match, but it wasn't. Wasn't a very good match at all. And then you had the Steiner brothers interfering, so you didn't even get a decisive finish here. And then you had the world title match, Kevin Nash versus DDP. Speaking of bad decisions, not only DDP winning the title, which didn't really go over that well with people, but also they turned DDP heel, which I think was a huge mistake. DDP as a heel just didn't work, and his title run was essentially a flop. So Kevin Nash wins the title here, whatever. All right, next up we have the 1999 Great American Bash, which was not a good pay-per-view at all. WCW really starting to fall apart at this point. The undercard wasn't that good, and the main event matches were not only bad but confusing. You had such classics on this show as Van Hammer versus Mikey Whipwreck. Really? You put this match on a pay-per-view and expect people to pay for it? Whatever. You had Ric Flair versus Roddy Piper for control of WCW once again, but this time you had Buff Bagwell costing Roddy Piper the match by accident. Roddy Piper's pissed off that this young punk doesn't respect his predecessors, so Piper decides to turn on Buff Bagwell and join with Ric Flair, the guy he's been feuding with for the past several months, the guy that he had committed. Now all of a sudden they're friends. I don't get it. Falls Count Anywhere, Ric Flair versus Sting. Another bad match with one of the cheesiest endings in pay-per-view history, where the two of them are brawling backstage and Scott Steiner unleashes a pack of dogs on Sting. The editing here is just so bad, so amateur hour. It actually makes for great unintentional comedy. And then speaking of comedy, you have the Steiners come out, knock the fans, and Rick Steiner says that Baltimore is the shittiest town in America, and that is an exact quote. Then you had the main event, Kevin Nash versus Randy Savage. Such entertaining build-up for this match, such as Randy Savage having a woman in a bag come out. Literally, she was stuffed in a bag, and she was able to fit in there and come out of the bag and dump a barrel of manure on Randy Savage. And then you have the big Hummer angle where Randy Savage had somebody run down Kevin Nash with a Hummer, and Nash was in the limousine. So this was WCW trying to beat WWE at their own game, trying to do these these edgy storylines, but WCW just couldn't pull it off like WWE. And then you had this match, which ended in your usual non-decisive finish. You had the return of Sid Vicious to WCW, laying out Kevin Nash. And apparently, it looked like that Sid was going to be reviewed as the guy that drove the Hummer, but no, apparently there was another guy. Why Sid couldn't just be the guy that ran down Kevin Nash, I don't know. But they decided, hey, we have a guy, we have a surprise guy we could bring in, have him be the one that ran down Kevin Nash. But we'll just say that there's actually somebody else. And of course, there really was nobody else. And the angle went nowhere. Don't understand what they were thinking with this. Next up, we have Bash at the Beach 99, another bad WCW pay-per-view. You had a hardcore invitational junkyard match, which was once again complete amateur hour. Had no idea what was going on here. Just a bunch of guys brawling in a junkyard. It was like World War III with guys in a junkyard, and it was just completely impossible to follow. And yeah, the less said about this, the better. One really good match. I wouldn't say it was a really good match, but I'd say it was a good match. The Triad, Bigelow, DDP, and Canyon against Chris Benoit and Perry Saturn. This was fine. And everything else on this show sucked. You had Buff Bagwell versus Roddy Piper in a boxing match with Mills Lane as the referee. This was terrible. And then you had the World Tag Team title match. Well, it wasn't for the World Tag Team title. It was actually a tag team match for the World Heavyweight title, if you can make sense of that. So if Kevin Nash got beat by Randy Savage, Sid, or his own partner, Sting, apparently, he would lose the title. And Randy Savage ended up beating Kevin Nash, winning the title, and his title reign would only last 24 hours because the next night, Hulk Hogan would make his big return and win back the title. Next up, we have the final Road Wild pay-per-view. The usual problem with Road Wild, as I mentioned with the previous shows, the biker crowd just didn't really care about the action. You had Randy Savage versus Dennis Rodman. By this point, Rodman had really been played out in WCW. The match was fairly entertaining. I mean, you had one moment where Savage was thrown in a porta potty. It was okay, and I did like the build up to this match. Rodman just using profanity on television and saying he's going to steal Gorgeous George away from Randy Savage. I mean, it was an entertaining storyline, and the match itself was okay. Really, the only thing I would recommend on this entire show to watch. World Heavyweight title match. Hulk Hogan ditched the NWO colors, went back to being the red and yellow Hulk Hogan. Another desperate ratings ploy by WCW. They did this whole thing where Hogan went back to the red and yellow the same night that Chris Jericho debuted in WWE. This was their counter for that. And, it was just your standard Hulk Hogan match. Hulk Hogan gets beat up by the big man, makes his comeback, leg drop, Hulk Hogan retains the title. Nothing much to see here. And this was Kevin Nash's supposed retirement, but of course he would be back 2 months later. And then things finally started to really unravel in WCW backstage. Eric Bischoff, after several months of WCW going downhill, not just in the quality of the shows, but the numbers were dropping, and Eric Bischoff was sent home. And then you had the Fall Brawl 1999 pay-per-view, which was basically just WCW without a leader, without any kind of real direction. And you could really tell with this show how bad things had gone in WCW, because this was the first pay-per-view where you could really notice how much the crowds had dropped. Half the arena was empty for this show, and the matches were really boring and bland. The main event, Sting versus Hogan, another brilliant WCW idea. You have Sting, the most beloved babyface in WCW history, a guy that people were still cheering for whatever reason, I guess to draw ratings. You turn the guy heel against Hulk Hogan and have him align with Lex Luger. Another terrible decision by WCW. Sting heel turn just didn't work. Nobody wanted to see Sting as a heel. Yet another bad decision. Then you had the arrival of Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara to WCW. And their first pay-per-view was Halloween Havoc 99. And a lot of people were very hopeful because Russo and Ferrara had a lot of success with the Attitude Era in WWE, and people thought that these guys would be able to save WCW. But the problem here is WCW fans didn't want to see the Attitude Era crash TV. They wanted to see WCW. They wanted an alternative to WWE. And first thing you notice with this Halloween Havoc pay-per-view, it is essentially WCW trying to be like WWE. You have all these sex references. You have all these backstage cuts and backstage segments. The show was very fast-paced, and that was one of the things Vince Russo was known for, was putting on these fast-paced shows. So, it was a lot more entertaining to watch than the Fall Brawl pay-per-view, which was just very boring. At least this show was entertaining, not necessarily good. You had this world title match, Sting versus Hulk Hogan, and Hogan basically just lays down for Sting, and they try to act like something was going on behind the scenes, where Hogan had some kind of issue with the bookers, and we basically got no match, no world title match. But they try to make it up to you. Sting comes out, says he wants a title match. Goldberg comes out, they have a quick match, and Goldberg wins the title. So, everybody watching is happy. All right, Goldberg won the title, cool. But then, of course, the next night, Goldberg is stripped of the title, and they build a tournament, and I'll get to that in a second here. Goldberg versus Sid Vicious on this show. They had... I actually do like the finish, even though it wasn't decisive, but it was a way to protect Sid. Sid was busted open, he was bleeding like crazy, and the referee just stopped the match. So at least it was a way for Sid to lose and still look strong. So, that was fine. DDP versus Ric Flair in a strap match, not so good. And just a lot of random things happening on this show. DDP and Kimberly coming out and just cutting a promo before the match. Just pretty much all over the place. And then you had the next pay-per-view, which was WCW Mayhem. So they had finally gotten rid of the World War III concept, but this was not really any better. This show, speaking of all over the place, you had essentially two decent matches on this show. Chris Benoit versus Jeff Jarrett. This was the finals of the WCW World Title Tournament after Goldberg had been stripped. And that whole thing was confusing too with the title, because Sting had called out somebody to face him, and the announcers acted like the title was on the line, and then they said, no, the title's not on the line. And then Goldberg won the match. He was announced as the new champion. He held up the title. But then the next night, they stripped him, saying that Sting never said it was a title match. So you had this tournament here, Benoit versus Jeff Jarrett. This was WCW's first pay-per-view event from Canada. And the crowd was really hot. The thing about this show that's really interesting is that at the start of the show, the crowd was really on fire for this. They really wanted to have a good show here. They wanted to be entertained, and they were willing to make a lot of noise. But by the time this show was over, I was shocked at how much the crowd just completely died. And that really shows you how this concept, this Crash TV concept, wasn't working. Because you went from having a really hot crowd at the beginning to a dead crowd at the end. And Benoit and Jarrett was a good match. And then you had Benoit versus Bret Hart. But with Benoit and Jarrett, the crowd was really into it. With Benoit and Hart, the crowd just wasn't into it all that much. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was all of the Crash TV that turned off the fans. You had matches like Vampiro versus Berlin, where you had Oklahoma out there repeating the same joke over and over again, and just tons of backstage segments and just a lot of things happening, maybe too many things happening. The crowd just got burned out, and the reaction was very disappointing by the end with Benoit and Hart. They had a really good match, but the crowd, you would think that they would have been more into it. But I don't know, it just the entire pay-per-view burned them out, and it was kind of a flat ending. And then you had Starrcade 99. The Cruiserweight title, which had been so hot in 97 and 98, was essentially a joke by this point. And the WCW matches, you could always count on WCW having a solid undercard And even if the main events weren't good, at least you knew you were getting some good wrestling. But now, you didn't even have the good undercards anymore. You had a lot of matches that had no business being on a pay-per-view. And then you had the world title match, Bret Hart versus Goldberg. WCW tried to recreate the Montreal Screwjob angle. Piper comes out. Bret Hart puts a sharpshooter on Goldberg. And then Piper just immediately calls for the bell. And that was the end of your Super Bowl for WCW. Was a recreation of the Montreal Screwjob. There was one really good match on the show. Chris Benoit versus Jeff Jarrett in a ladder match for the vacant U.S. title. I really enjoyed this. This was a very solid ladder match between these two, but everything else on the show you could skip over. Not really worth watching. So there you have it for my thoughts on WCW pay-per-views from 1999. Stay tuned because things get even worse as we head into the year 2000 for WCW. And next video I'll do 2000 and 2001 since there are only 3 pay-per-views in 2001. So see you next time for the conclusion to my reviews of the WCW pay-per-views. And it should be very interesting to look back at these shows. And it's going to be a lot of fun. So get the popcorn ready, and I'll see you guys next time.